Great, welcome. We have more and more folks coming in to the Zoom room here. We got 130 now. Probably will have more tuning in here. We'll go ahead and get started. First, I'm Katie Trazo. I'm the coordinator of the Virginia Beginning Farmer and Rancher Coalition. I also coordinate the Virginia Tech Catawba Sustainability Center's Forest Herb Network. On behalf of a number of partners, I welcome you here this evening, and these partners include the Virginia Beginning Farmer and Rancher, the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition, NC State, and Penn State. I'm just going to start us off with some technical logistics. First, your line is muted and your video is not enabled, and that's because we're in a Zoom webinar today. So the main way to interact with us is through the chat feature if you have comments, and through the Q&A feature if you'd like to add questions later at the end of the talk for the speakers. We'd also like to let you know that there are automatic live captions available. You can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom pane. You can view those through subtitles, or if you click full transcript, that'll come up kind of similar to how your chat box comes up. We'd also like to let you know that the session is being recorded and it will be archived on the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition's website. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please contact me, Katie Trazo, in the chat, or email me at ketrazo@vt.edu. And we have Margaret Bloomquist here, who's helping us with tech support, and she's putting all this information in the chat. So thank you, Margaret. So this session tonight is a part of a larger webinar series called Forest Farming in Focus, where we have 5 winter webinars on different non-timber forest products, really focused on a deeper dive into forest farming these species. If you find that you're missing some introductory material tonight, we want to encourage you to visit the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition website, where you can access beginning learning modules. There is a PDF that we've pulled together with all of our introductory materials, so that's available to you as well. Oops, went the wrong way. And before we get started with our session today, we wanted to just invite you into a moment of silence. I know many of our hearts and minds are with Ukraine right now, and just wanted to take a moment to honor the people of Ukraine and send wishes for their well-being and safety. So I just invite you into a really brief moment of silence. Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be here with you all this evening for this webinar called Digging Deeper into Ramp Forest Farming. The flow of the evening is we'll have a 201 presentation, then we'll hear from our ramp farmer, and then we'll have questions from you all. Our speakers this evening are Dr. Eric Burkhart of Penn State and Shavers Creek, and Steve Schwartz of Delaware Valley Ramps. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Eric Burkhart. Dr. Eric Burkhart is a botanist and ethnobotanist. He is director of the Appalachian Botany and Ethnobotany program at Shavers Creek Environmental Center. He is an associate teaching professor in ecosystem science and management at Penn State. His research and outreach program in Pennsylvania is focused on developing sustainable wild stewardship and agroforestry production systems for specialty forest products like ginseng, golden seal, and ramps. Thanks for coming today, Dr. Burkhart. And I'll briefly introduce Steve Schwartz of Delaware Valley Ramps. He's the chief forager there. This is a business he started by accident when he acquired a ramp full property on the Delaware River in Northeast Pennsylvania in 2006. He's also a consultant on conservation issues who has completed many land conservation projects. He began his career at the Trust for Public Land in the late 70s And from 2014 to 2021, he coordinated the work of partners in the Pocono cluster of the Delaware River Watershed Initiative and helped align their work with other local and regional stakeholders. He also organizes the biannual Upper Delaware BioBlitz, which brings together kids and families with more than 50 professional biologists and amateur naturalists who have conducted 5 surveys for the BioBlitz since 2013. Currently, Steve is kicking off the maple sugaring season while keeping the home fire burning. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Steve. We will pass it to Eric, and then Steve will be sharing afterwards. So Eric, I will stop sharing my screen and let you share yours.
Good evening, everybody. Good to see a lot of folks out there, 220 of you, 221 now. All right. From all over the place. Saw some folks from the West Coast. I also saw some folks from just down the street. So it's great to have you all here, wherever you're coming from. We got a lot of material to get through tonight, and it's going to go fairly quickly. So with that said, I wanted to just remind everybody, in case it was forgotten or was missed in the introduction, I'm here with Penn State University. Here's some of my information for those who are on social media, in particular Instagram. You can find me there. And I also have a website that if it wasn't shared already, I'll put it in the chat when we get towards the section when we get to Steve. And I want to point out that there's some resources for you, as Katie was just mentioning. So specifically, last year, we did a series of ramp forest farming webinars that don't overlap necessarily with what you're going to hear tonight. Of course, it's about ramps, but these were intended to provide a lot more background information, things like how do you identify a ramp? So I would just encourage you to take a look at the informational sheet that you were provided with. Each of these webinars is about an hour to an hour and 50 minutes, depending. And they all have different pieces of information that may or may not be shared tonight. So, you know, if you're brand new to ramps, and I think a lot of you are, or brand new to forest farming, and I think a lot of you are, there's a lot of background information that we've provided through these webinars. So you'll see one on identification, uses, and cultural importance, one on the biology and stewardship of the species, as well as one that invited a panel of folks that are operating here in the Mid-Atlantic that harvest and or sell ramps as part of a business or personal recreational model. So again, this is a 201 session. So if something slips through the cracks, you're not exactly sure what the details are of anything I'm explaining, there's some background information for you to take a look at afterwards. So we're going to talk about forest farming, obviously. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. Forest farming is an agroforestry practice. That is, it combines overstory crop trees with understory crops, in this case, an herbaceous perennial crop known as ramps. And you'll note that I've highlighted that ramps can be introduced into a forest farming system, or they can be managed in that forest farming system. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that to kind of set up our session for tonight before we get into talking about some of the more advanced farming practices around ramps, and then turning our attention to Steve Schwartz, who's going to share a little bit about his business and how he manages his ramps. I just want to share a little diagram for folks who are not familiar necessarily with the practice of agroforestry. You can find, if you Google National Agroforestry Center, it's a USDA center out of Nebraska, of all places, but they have a variety of different information about agroforestry practices here in North America. Many of the agroforestry practices that we talk about operate from a presumption that you're going to be starting with an open piece of ground and you're going to be planting woody species into that ground. Tonight, we're talking about forest farming, and most forest farming is pursued with an existing forest. That is, you're looking at a forest that is standing and you're trying to manage crops in the understory as opposed to, let's say, starting a forest from scratch. Now, it's certainly possible to plant trees in a field and end up with a forest in 100 years, but If you're like me, you probably don't want to wait that long. So we're going to talk about forest farming kind of as a model from forest management. Most people, when we think about forest farming, have in their mind some sort of idea like you see here. Now, these aren't ramps. This is ginseng. We do have a workshop coming up on ginseng in a month, by the way. But most people think about this term farming, that if I'm going to be managing a crop in the forest, that I'm doing some tillage, I'm putting beds in, I'm buying planting stock and putting it in the forest. And while that may be the approach that you take as an individual producer, tonight we're going to be talking about ramps, which are still in abundance across much of the landscape of Eastern North America. And so we want to kind of also approach it from the standpoint of it can often be a much less intensive or impactful process. Okay. And so while you can go out and buy ramp bulbs and seeds and that sort of thing off the internet, or off of people who are selling ramps from their property, it can get quite pricey as a commodity, right? As something that you're going to plan out there and see what happens. So here you can see 25 plants for $17. Okay, so it can add up really quickly. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some of the shortcuts to establishing ramps and doing it quickly without a whole lot of investment up front in nursery planting stock. Okay, so what I refer to this as is the low-hanging fruit approach. Okay, and so while if you don't have any ramps on your property, you can certainly introduce them, and we'll talk a little bit about how you might do that as we move along tonight. We're also going to approach forest farming from the standpoint of maybe you have ramps on your property and you're just trying to think about ways that you can manage those populations to get more of them. And so we're looking at it from the standpoint of maybe you've got something that looks like this or not quite as extensive of this on your property, and you may or may not be harvesting them for personal or commercial use, but you're thinking about, I don't want to wipe them out. So what do I do to tend this patch? How do I get more of them? How do I manage them? What level of harvest should I be doing? All these types of questions that come about when we think about growing ramps in a forest understory. Okay, and a big part of that is going to involve this husbandry idea. Okay, that this idea of the plant material may not be purchased. It might be something that you barter with a neighbor or another forest farmer for. It might be something, as we're going to talk about, that you're doing within your own ramp patch to spread it around, if you will, taking bulbs and introducing them to new areas, for example. And so the idea here is that we've got a variety of different approaches to forest farming, and some of these terms may look familiar to some of you, maybe not. On the left side, we have this wild stewardship model, right? So if we're harvesting from wild populations, we're thinking about how do we return the plants to the population, right? So when we remove a plant, what are we trying to do to encourage that it's replaced, right? So reseeding, for example, or dividing bulbs, as we're going to talk about with ramps. On the other end of the spectrum, we have this idea of woods cultivated, much more like what I showed you in the picture a few moments ago about farming the woods, building beds, creating a clear cultivated area. And that's certainly a possibility. But then there's this kind of nebulous area in the middle where we're trying to do more intentional and intensive management, but we wouldn't really call it cultivation, but it's something more than just going out and picking ramps, right? And so all of these things are options that we have available to us when we talk about forest farming of a lot of these non-timber forest products, ramps included. Typically, when we think about forest farming in a forest understory, we're thinking about what you see on the center or the right model here, which is that we're not necessarily converting the understory of our forest to a monoculture, if you will, of ramps. Now, I showed you a picture a moment ago, and I'll show you more pictures as we move along. We'll call them eye candy, okay, where we've got abundant ramp populations that look like they might be in a monocultural arrangement just because they're so abundant in an area. But I suspect many of you have some familiarity with ramps, and you realize that ramps are just the beginning of what's to come in a forest understory. When they emerge in the springtime, they may be the dominant species, but soon they're replaced or they're joined by many other species over the course of the season. And so we try and encourage more desirable companion species, oftentimes veering towards what you see on the right, a polycultural arrangement where we're not really farming the woods in the sense of we're making lots of rows of plants, but rather managing the plant understory for more desirable composition as well as for more plants of what we want. And so you can find examples of this on social media of people doing this type of thing. Here's just one screenshot that I grabbed a couple of years ago that was posted on a rant group you can see in West Virginia, where someone started a rant patch and it effectively spread. And so tonight, one of the things we're going to be talking about is how does that work? How do you get that to happen if you have a small patch? Where do rants grow? How do you propagate them? How do you get this patch to spread? And so finally, before I jump into that, I just want to acknowledge then that Steve Schwartz, who's with us, is going to kind of round out our session tonight by talking about how he's been doing just exactly this. So Steve approaches it from the standpoint of he had an existing rant patch on the property when he acquired it, and he's been working ever since to tend and manage the ramps while also harvesting them for commercial sale. And so that's a very viable model. And one that we want to acknowledge is perhaps an easier route for many of you with forest lands with ramps on it than going out and buying plant material and starting to make beds and things of that nature, okay? So let's just start from the standpoint of take care of your rant patch and your rant patch will take care of you, okay? Appalachian proverb. And what that means is that we talk about forest farming, and let's just call it harvest sustainability. Whether you're foraging in an intensive way or growing ramps in the understory of a forest through different types of horticultural and propagation, it all comes down to how do we do this sustainably? What kinds of activities can we do aside from just harvesting the plants to make sure that we have abundant populations and perhaps even increase the population while we're harvesting over time rather than decreasing it? And so you'll see I've got a variety of different things that I'm going to touch on here in the next 25 to 30 minutes or so about this idea of sustainability. A lot of people are mistakenly thinking that sustainability in ramp harvesting or non-timber forest products in general is achieved by one kind of magic bullet, and it's not. There's a variety of different things that go in to managing these resources, and I suspect many of you know this. So if we start on the upper right-hand side, we get into this question of, well, how frequently can I harvest the ramps, right? Can I do it every year? How big is the population, and does that matter? What's the intensity of it, right? What's the scale and volume? How many harvesters could harvest a patch before it becomes unsustainable? What are the harvest methods that are involved? Can we use shovels or our hands better, right? In terms of getting in there and removing plants. Which plant part should we harvest? Is it the bulb? Is it the leaf? Is it the flowering scape? What about site quality and productivity? Ramps are growing on forest lands. Some sites are better than others. And so how does that play a role in ramp sustainability? Stewardship practices. And so we'll talk a lot about that tonight. These are these farming activities, if you will, these horticultural propagation activities that you might engage with, bulb division, seed planting, competing vegetation removal, selecting for better ramp habitat, for example. And then we're looking at this from an observational and adjustment standpoint, right? How do we adjust when we start to see that maybe we're harvesting a little bit too much or something didn't fill in after a harvest, that sort of thing, right? And then finally at 12 o'clock, if you will, we got this whole thing about, does it matter when I harvest ramps? Okay, so what's the timing and the stage got to do with it? So all of these things are going to combine. And for you as a forest farmer, it may be that some of these things are more important than others. Okay, and this is where we get into some really rich dialogue. And sometimes on social media, you see a lot of back and forth, unfortunately, people going at one another because somebody believes that one way is better than another. There's a variety of different science that shares light as well as practice on ramp sustainability. And all of these things tend to have some influence on forest lands. So let's start with habitat quality. Okay, because what I'm arguing and what I'll suggest first is that habitat, the productivity of the habitat where ramps are either introduced or where they're found, influences everything. So as you look around that circle that I just highlighted, most of the variables that we're going to talk about are influenced by the quality of the habitat and how quickly plants can recover, grow, and reproduce in that habitat. And so a little bit of eye candy for you to get us started here. Okay, these are some Pennsylvania patches, if you will. These are harvested areas. Okay, these are areas that ramps occur naturally, but the harvesters that are operating in these areas are also doing different activities to encourage recovery from their operations, right? And so you'll notice a lot of ramps in this site, right? Here's another one. There's a site from north central Pennsylvania. Okay, you could imagine that no matter what you do, at least theoretically in this area, it would be a hard time to wipe this stuff out, short of putting a parking lot in here. But that depends. It depends on the scale of intensive impact, right? So even in a site like this, if one was commercially oriented and harvesting tens of thousands of pounds every year without paying attention to activities that replenish the resource, eventually there's going to be a decline in the abundance of the plants. And so what we're trying to do is encourage people to recognize the abundance that's naturally there in many areas and seek to manage it. Or if you're new to ramps and you don't have something like this on your property, how do you get something like this started? And it really starts with recognizing where ramps grow. And so as you look at these sites, you see, these are forested areas, right? And oftentimes they're sloped, and that may have something to do with the agricultural or history of land use in the area in some cases. Okay? But in other areas, we notice that they're found near streams, for example, on northeast facing slopes and so on. So site does have something to do with it. Okay? One of the things that you can notice out there is that people will actually take ramps and they'll plant them in open sunlight conditions. Maybe some of you have done this. I have some ramps actually that I started in one of my flower beds a number of years ago, and they're spreading in full sunlight. So they're doing just well in sunlight. So ramps actually grow just fine in full sunlight. They may not reproduce there very well, but they can grow and photosynthesize there. And so it brings up, what do we know about the horticulture of ramps that tells us what the important features are? Janine Davis, who's on here, has done a lot of research with ramps for a longer time than I have. And she's even got a chapter in her book, if you're not familiar with it, that talks about some of these features. But I just want to hit on a couple of them insofar that they help us understand about the importance of site. So this is a study that was done in Canada, where technically you're not allowed to harvest ramps for commercial purposes, only for personal consumption. And so there's been a large interest in trying to figure out how you grow ramps horticulturally in that part of the world. A couple of things that are important to note is, as I've highlighted here, these researchers found that ramps are flexible enough to grow in a variety of environmental conditions, not just in forested canopies, right? Because they're photosynthesizing during the time when there's no leaves on the canopies. Okay, and so they suggest that ramps can be grown in agricultural fields. However, abundant soil moisture is important. Okay, and so we've got this kind of interesting observation that's been shared with us from some of the horticulturalists about what's important here. And the important thing I want to point out here is that sunlight, or full sunlight, is actually not the enemy of ramps. Okay, they grow just fine, as you all know, in the springtime under full sunlight before the canopy gets out. Okay, so what else is it that influences them? One of the bigger factors seems to be soil moisture. So just a quick kind of update from some of the work we've been doing here in Pennsylvania around this. When you look at where ramps grow in a state like Pennsylvania, I've got a student working on this right now. Okay, a large percentage of the location that you're going to find ramps are going to be on these lower slope positions or floodplains. Okay, that's where the moisture congregates. That's where things run down slope, right? So that's where our richer sites are, where the moisture sits, and that's often throughout the growing season. And so by that association, if you look at the aspect, that is which way a hill or topographic element faces, it usually is found on the cooler and moister slopes. So here you can see east, north, northeast, southeast. These are the places that ramps tend to grow. And so the first thing I want to mention to you is this importance of moisture. Ramps like cool, moist conditions. They tend to naturally occur in these lower slope positions where moisture is found throughout the growing season. And that also means then that topographically, we're looking at areas that tend to be east or north facing, where it's cooler and moister. And one of the reasons for that is that ramps have a very shallow root system. I suspect some of you, like me, enjoy growing onions and garlic. I'm just getting ready to start my onion seed in the basement under lights. And one of the things we know from horticulture is that allium species, and this is an allium species, tend to have very shallow fibrous roots that come off the base of the bulb, which means that they don't go very deep into the soil. And so one of the things that tends to limit their occupation of sites that are otherwise viable for them is the lack of adequate moisture throughout the growing season. And so what I've got here is just a very simple soil moisture chart that we've recorded here in Pennsylvania at some sites. And you can see that across the growing season, there is sufficient moisture. Upwards of 30 to 50% of the soil moisture volume is filled during the growing season. So one of the things you want to look at when you're thinking about growing ramps, whether it's introducing or spreading them around your property, is where are those sites where it's moist throughout the growing season? When you stick your finger down in the soil and you feel that it's not wet, it's not spongy and swampy, there's not skunk cabbage there, for example, but it's moist. Okay. Along with that, some of our, again, friends from the forest farming research community have pointed out that surface applied calcium in the form of limestone, for example, tends to improve the growth of ramps and survival of ramps, particularly on acidic sites. And so one of the things that we found in association with moisture here in Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic is that ramps are typically found on these limestone-derived sites that have abundant calcium of 3,000 pounds to the acre and above. Many of the species that we might look for as indicators of those sites include plants like blue cohosh. In fact, across 35 sites in Pennsylvania that we are studying right now, blue cohosh tends to be the top understory indicator for us of both soil moisture as well as abundant calcium. And you can see blue cohosh here, this little kind of weird thing that's sticking up just above the top understory, has the bluish cast. This is a species some of you may not recognize, but it blooms very early. There's actually flowers on there. Okay? And later in the season, it becomes much more apparent, as you can see in this picture. You see the ramps mixed in there, for example, okay, as it leafs out and produces fruit. In the overstory, we often see sugar maple as a top indicator. Now, these are not the only species, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of, we're looking at species that like it moist and abundant calcium. And you can see in this particular study location, this is up near Lake Erie, it's northwestern Pennsylvania, we have a little stream that's going through. And that's no accident, right? So we're looking at toe slope to floodplain position for a lot of where ramps grow abundantly. And this is important because when we talk about all these management activities, ramps will sometimes just sit there like they sit in my garden. They don't really do a whole lot because they just don't have the right conditions. And what do we mean by right conditions? Soil moisture and calcium are two big factors. Now let's turn our attention, knowing that site quality is an extremely important governing matter then. Does it matter when I harvest my ramps if I'm managing for a forest farming endeavor? Well, let me talk a little bit about this. People are starting already to harvest ramps. You can see on social media, people out there digging the plants, even in some cases from underneath the snow. Okay, I'm not here to judge this. I'm only going to share a little bit of information about, what we have measured in terms of harvest impacts. All right. So people tend to harvest ramps all the way from shoot stage, like you can see here, through the flowering stage during the summer months. And the question becomes, does it matter? Does it matter sustainability-wise in particular? Okay. So here's a couple of different products that you see from social media posts. And I would just ask you to think to yourself, if you look at the picture on the left and the product that's being sold in Pittsburgh, for example, and you look at the product on the right, you might notice that there's a difference in the shaft of the ramp. And so I'm referencing below the leaves, going down the shaft of the plant down to where the roots are. You'll notice on the right side that the bulb is much more swollen towards the base. And oftentimes you notice this in pictures, but maybe you haven't really put together what's going on there. Okay? And so to put it another way, here's some scans I made of some plants a few years ago. And you can see from April 12th to May 12th, it doesn't matter how many leaves the plants have. All of these have different numbers of leaves. You'll notice that there is a thickening of the bulb. Doesn't matter whether the plants are green or purple shafted, and that's a whole nother conversation, but you'll notice that the bulbs swell up typically as the spring goes on. So what's going on there? Ramps, like many wild onions, are using that photosynthetic window to actually fix a lot of photosynthates, take those carbohydrates and store them down at the base of the plant. So a bulb, as we're going to talk a little bit more about as we move forward, is essentially a type of storage organ in plants where the carbohydrates and photosynthates are stored at the base of the leaves, okay? And that means that the leaves swell up. So the same thing happens if you grow onions or garlic. You have the same process that unfolds. And so as you look across 7 different stages of harvest during a typical season for ramps, you'll notice what we've measured, that typically once we get to mid and late season, that bulb has swollen up. And so what's the significance of that, you might ask? First of all, just note that it doesn't matter how many leaves the plants have, right? So sometimes they have 1 leaf, sometimes 2 leaves, sometimes 3. They all tend to follow this pattern where as the season goes on, they get bigger bulbs. The bigger the plants and the more leaves they have, the more mass they have. And that's what's being illustrated here. And so the practical significance of that is that when we talk about harvesting ramps for a market, many of you, if you're harvesting commercially, will recognize that it's often sold on weight, right? So you might be selling it by the pound, for example. And if you look at what's happening here, if you wait until the bulbs have sized up, you're putting in oftentimes a fraction of the plants that would otherwise need to be harvested, okay, for that same weight, if you follow. Okay, so take a look at the 3-leaved all the way to the right here. If we're harvesting on April 12th, when we still have those pencil roots and when the bulb hasn't really started to form yet because the plant is actively photosynthesizing and emerging and that sort of thing, it takes 104 plants to make a pound, okay? If we wait until that May 12th date, that's the maroon bar there, it's less than half of the number of individual plants that we have to put in that same weight. So if we talk about the impact to a population, if you're filling orders, the longer you can wait during that growing season, the less plants you have to remove to equal that same weight. Okay, that's an important consideration if you can adjust your marketing appropriately. Okay, and so this is what a nice flat, big fat bulbs would look like, for example, at that May 12th date. Okay, now one other thing I want to mention about this that may factor into when to harvest is that we've been studying some of the phytochemistry up here at Penn State as well. And in particular, we've been looking at one of the compounds that you often find in onions or garlic, known as allicin. And what we found is you look at these 7 stages of harvest that I just mentioned, that there is a difference in the total phenolic compounds. These are antioxidant compounds, as well as allicin levels based on the stage. Harvesting the bulbs actually when they flower during the middle of the summer actually results in the highest levels of medicinal compounds. Okay, we believe that that's due to what is often found in other plants, that the plants are trying to defend their reproductive structures, right? So they're producing a lot more of these compounds. Okay, you'll notice if you're looking at a leaf-only harvest that the highest allicin compound actually occurs at the leaf peak stage, which is those big green leaves that are nice and fat after they're fully emerged, but before they turn yellow. Okay, harvesting leaves at the emergence stage early in the season results in the highest antioxidant compounds, the total phenolics. So not to get too much down a rabbit hole, but there is a phytochemistry element to this as well. If you're interested in maximizing the nutritional or the medicinal aspects of this, we have some emerging research that suggests that the stage of harvest does matter. So for example, if you're making pickle items or extracts, right, things that you're trying to maximize these compounds like allicin. Now, let's move on and talk about, can I harvest from the same area, right? How much can I do? How frequently can I do this? And the answer is, what's the size of your ramp patch? That might seem self-explanatory, but it's extremely important. We can't answer how much you can take unless we know exactly what's going on, right? How many plants, how big? The patch on the left side, for example, is a much smaller patch than what you see on the right. And so saying that we're going to take, let's say, 10% of a population, well, what does that mean? It depends on what the population size is. So that does point to the fact that there is no ultimate number that we can point to say, well, if you only harvest 10%, you're going to be sustainable. It depends. It depends on 10% of what? 10% of this is very different than 10% of this, right? And so we see some studies that have been done. And again, it's not to fault these studies because they provide us with some good information about how these plants can be over-harvested. This is a study that was done by Janet Rock way back in the 2000s. And you can see that they found that a 10% harvest once every 10 years on average would be a sustainable level of harvest. Okay, that doesn't sound like a whole lot. The way that you should interpret that is that these plants can be over-harvested quite readily. They're very slow-growing perennial plants, and we need to be careful and practice restraint when we go in and harvest. Okay, 10% of a site like this doesn't really tell us a whole lot, right? And so we want to think first of all about the vigor of the site and the size of the population when we start to think about, well, how much can I possibly remove from this area and be sustainable? What our friends to the north have found is that if you look and think about it as a fixed bulb density, that is, you look down at the ground and you try and figure out, let's say, what a square foot is, and you harvest towards a density per square foot, right? That's going to be a much more effective way of keeping track of how much your impact is on the area than trying to estimate what 10% would be, because of the variation and variability that we see in the size of the patches and the productivity of the patches. And so the way I like to think about this is, many of you probably have a strawberry patch, myself included. You want to think about what you do in a strawberry patch. A strawberry patch can quickly become overgrown and none of the plants become particularly productive, right? And so oftentimes on an annual or semi-annual basis, we have to go in and we have to thin those strawberry plants, right? We might give them to our neighbors or put them somewhere else on the property. And that in turn encourages the remaining strawberry plants to be more vigorous and more fruitful and more healthy. And so we want to take a similar type of approach when we think about managing ramps. We want to think about what is there and how can we thin the patch to a fixed density and practice restraint. Okay, and so looking down at individual plants, getting a sense for how much is in the area, how thick they're growing, and how to thin them. And so in this particular case, this plant is a clonal plant, and these are actually 3 bulbs coming off of the same basal plate. At 12 o'clock, we've got a 2-leafer. At 4 o'clock, we've got a 2-leafer. And at 8 o'clock, we've got a 2-leafer. So thinning might mean that we reach our hands down or excavate a little and pull one or two of those plants off, leaving one in place, much like, again, we would do in a strawberry patch. And we do that because this, again, is a clonal plant. So if you dig down in the soil, what you'll find is that the bulbs, especially as they swell up, are recognizable. And you can see where they're attached to one another. And so it's easy to think, now I can just take two of these off and leave maybe two or three behind, right, to replenish. We often do that, myself anyway, with my hands. You can see in this particular case, this was a harvester that went into an area with a mattock and kind of took a little bit, it's like, what's the saying about a bull in a china shop? Oftentimes accidentally damaging nearby plants, excavating other plants that we might want to retain in the patch, trilliums, blue cohosh, other things for diversity. And so oftentimes if we wait for those bulbs to size up, it's a lot easier to do hand harvesting. A lot of people advocate for a leaf-only harvest. You see that a lot on the internet. You see it a lot on social media, okay? In theory, it's a good idea. In fact, there's a cousin species, Allium ursinum, known as bear garlic, that's found across Europe. And I'm told from colleagues in Germany, for example, that it's illegal to remove the bulbs, that you can only harvest the tops. But it does beg the question that if these plants are using the tops to photosynthesize in the springtime, they're fixing all that sunlight into carbohydrates to put it into the bulbs. Is there an impact, right? And the short answer is there must be some sort of impact, right? Defoliation of plants when they're at that exact time in their life cycle where we're removing all of the foliage is not necessarily sustainable in and of itself as well. Okay? And so think about it this way. In some of our sites in Pennsylvania, we've measured the light coming through the canopy on some of these ramp sites. And you can see when the plants are out in April and spring, they're getting a lot of full sunlight, right? 50% or greater of sunlight is coming down. That's when they're doing all of the photosynthesis that they're going to rely on to produce seed at a later time. Okay, and so we're removing the tops at that exact period of time, which doesn't seem like it would be that sustainable. And so what the folks have found, again, in Canada, when they did these leaf-only harvests, is that they didn't necessarily find that it affected the survival of the plants, but they did find that it had an effect on the subsequent plant growth. That is, the plants didn't necessarily reproduce in some cases, or at least the biomass was reduced in subsequent years. So there is an impact from just removing the leaves. So if a leaf harvest only is going to be pursued, you need to think about the fact that how are you going to rotate through your areas so that you're not defoliating the plants each and every year? Or are you only going to take one leaf, for example, from a 3-leaf plant instead of removing the entire foliage for the plant? Okay, if we move ahead in forest farming here, what about active management of the populations? Can you divide the bulb or replant the base? This is a strategy that people use in forest farming quite a bit to get more plants. Let's remind ourselves that this is an allium species. It's related to onions and garlic. And so we have this basal plate that's at the bottom of the plant and these storage organs, right? These are the leaf bases that are swollen up with carbohydrates. Here they're labeled as the fleshy scale leaf, okay? And so what about trying to trim part of that piece off and replanting? This is often advocated as a sustainable harvest strategy, but to my knowledge, there's no publications or scientific kind of science out there about whether this works or not. We've been planting some stuff here at Penn State and kind of monitoring survival. We don't see much survival, frankly. And so I would invite you all in the Q&A that if you have some experience with this, if this is part of your forest farming practice, to share that. It's something that we need to investigate more of. And the whole idea, as you can see here, is probably dependent on the size of that basal piece. So we know with other plants that are clonally propagated or vegetatively propagated, that how much of the tissue that remains at the top of the roots is often a major factor in determining whether the plants can regrow. We just don't have enough information, again, to my knowledge, that tells us whether this is a viable strategy or not. But we do know that ramps are clonal species and they do divide. And so with enough time, this can take years to happen, 2 to 3 to 4 years, we can get baby plants separating off of parent plants. And that's what this is illustrating here. So we have this basal plate at the left side with roots connected to it, and you've got this membranous sheath just above it. And then we also have 2 plants that are in the process of dividing from a single bulb. And this is what happens in ramp populations. So all of those leaves that we were looking at in the understory of the plant or the forest typically are associated with more than one bulb. They're usually affixed to a basal plate with sister clonal plants that are also surrounding it. And that's what you see here. This is during the flowering stage, and that's why you see that stalk that's coming off, but it's much easier to see the bulbs. And so during the summer and late summer and fall months, you can actually get into populations and start to move some of these bulbs around, right? Especially if they don't have flowers or fruit on them. So you see how the bulbs are developing. On the left side, we have a single bulb on a little basal plate. And on the right side, we have 2 bulbs attached to the same basal plate. Those are clones. And so we can divide those, put one back in the harvest hole and take another one and either send it to market or consume it, or we can move it to another part of our property and start a new patch with it. So clonal propagation is absolutely possible from bulb division. We just don't know enough about how much of the bulb has to be present before you can actually start to, let's say, cut the top off and just leave a little basal portion. Right? And in nature, what you see is that populations will actually start just from a single plant that spreads out over time, as you see here. One little plant that someone planted over a period of 4 to 5 years, spreading slowly but surely. So you can imagine that if you just went through your forest and started plugging in bulbs after dividing them and waiting 4 or 5 years, that you would start to get these little green patches that are forming throughout your forest lands. All right. And so here you see a hand with those bulbs, and we can pick them up, divide them, plant them out, as I just suggested, as a strategy for making more plants and increasing the size of our forest farm. Final thing I'm going to touch on is, what about those seeds? So this is a flowering plant. Many people don't recognize that because the flowering occurs after the spring months during the summer, and the leaves are gone at that point. So I have done workshops and talked with folks where they had no idea that the plants actually produced the flowers that they were used to seeing during the summer months. They just thought it was some sort of wildflower that was out there in their forest lands. So what happens at the end of the growing season, as many of you are aware, is that the plants will turn yellow. This is kind of that post-peak stage that we started off talking about, and they'll die back. But what they're doing is they're sending, again, all those carbohydrates back to the leaf bases and swelling up that bulb. And then they're going to start to produce a scape in many cases. That's what we call this, leafless stem, with a little bit of a flower bud on the top of it. That flower bud starts to swell up. Typically, when we get into June or July here in Pennsylvania. And by the time we get to July, we see these little snowballs all over the place. Now, let me just note, remember when I said about harvest stage, doesn't matter. If you want to maximize the allicin content and total phenolics, this is the stage that you want. This can be used in a vinegar, for example, and many people, myself included, use it that way. So just like chive flowers or something like that, you can pick the blossoms off and you can include it in a vinegar recipe or a food recipe at that point. Okay, but otherwise we're thinking about the seed crop that's going to follow. So this is what the flowers look like during the summer months. This is taken at some of those same sites that I showed in the pictures just a few moments ago. And as we talked about, the sites will change. The leaves are gone at this point. And so now we might not recognize that these are actually ramps. Okay, they have a bulb attached to them. with a scape that comes off and a little umbel inflorescence with little flowers that open over a period of weeks, producing little ovaries. This is where the name tricoccum comes from, by the way. That means three berried. Somebody thought these look like three little fleshy berries. The plants, by the way, are self-compatible, although you see little pollinators moving the genes back and forth. And so big populations, you'll see these little native honeybees, or I'm sorry, sweat bees. And in Canada, they found that the plants can be self-compatible. So that means that the pollen that's from a single flower can land on the stigma of the same flower and can result in seed set. All right, so this is what our plants are going to look like in mid to late summer as our seeds are starting to mature. And this is what our seeds look like as they're starting to mature. They're black, they're shiny, they're round, and they're often persisting on the plants through late summer and fall. And so this is the time when we don't want to forget about our ramp patch, right? We're all focused on our ramp patch because we're excited about spring and harvesting the goodies, but let's not forget about the back end where we go out and we gather these seeds up, okay, and we put them back in the soil. And the reason is that, as Janine has found out, these are tricky to germinate in a typical way that we might grow onions or leeks. They can be unreliable at best. A big part of that is because of the stratification requirements. And so when we see what they do in nature, they're often dropping off of the plants in the fall months and germinating underneath the leaves. And so here I've pulled the leaves away, and you can see the little baby ramps coming up from the seeds from basically going to produce new plants. And so scattering the seeds around in the fall months underneath the leaf duff is a strategy for increasing your population, because the seeds will grow into bulbs, and that's what we're going to want to harvest. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to transition over to Stephen Schwartz, and he's going to talk a little bit about his approach to growing ramps on forest lands. I'm going to be advancing his slides for him, so just give us a moment to transition.
Hi, how are you doing? The middle of winter here in the upper Delaware river watershed, and I live with the ramps, so I keep track of them all year long. Delaware Valley Ramps is a business that I started after I had bought the property 16 years ago. I bought the property, closed in September, was walking around with a neighbor, and he said, "See all those little black BBs?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Those are ramps." And I knew what ramps were, but I didn't know that they were all over the property. So all of a sudden, I owned property on a beautiful river with beautiful woods that were full of ramps. Next slide, please. So I started a business, and we gather and procure and sell ramps and other wild forest edibles. But by a large portion, ramps are the biggest part of the business. Next slide. We're on the Delaware River, up near where it starts, in Equinunk, Pennsylvania. It's about 3 miles south of Hancock, New York. Next slide, please. So it's the absolute northeast corner of Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. We have 20 acres of mature, healthy, sweet deciduous hardwoods, and basically the property is everything from the road to the river. Next slide, please. That's what it looks like around now. Next slide, please. So the forest composition is mature hardwoods, ash, black cherry, maple, black birch, apple, hickories. There were a few pines on the property at one point. There is very few oaks, and there's only the black walnuts that I planted by mistake. The ramps tend to not like the pine, the oak, the walnut. Many of you have dug ramps from rocky, wet hillsides. The ramps on my property grow in sandy, loamy soil. It's about 5 feet of sandy, loamy soil that's been deposited since the last ice age. And it's has been called the best soil in Wayne County. And just for comparison, it's also excellent for cultivating garlic and onions and potatoes and other things like that. Next slide, please. And in the canopy, under the canopy, there are all kinds of other spring ephemerals that come up that we get to enjoy while we're out harvesting ramps. May apples in abundance, trillium, trout lilies, etc. But there's also other things that come up in the woods. We've done a little logging that always brings in other things, and you know, it's a constant effort to identify what else is growing and where we can try to manage that. Next slide, please. So this is where we are right now, and Eric made some really good points about the habitat and the suitability of the property for growing and managing and harvesting ramps sustainably. And he also made a really good point about how it's all about the seeds. And I have sent ramps to the Eastern Sierras. They will grow almost anywhere, but they won't reproduce as they will when they're seeds. So if you go out into the woods right now, in the snowpack, you should see all these little seed heads, or the old seed heads, coming up through the snow. And that's really what I look for, is, are we producing a lot of flowers and a lot of seeds? Right. And just, it's also a great time to get out. We also sell fiddlehead ferns, and one of the easiest ways to identify fiddlehead ferns is this time of year, the fertile fronds are coming up through the snowpack. Next slide, please. So we're right about here right now. We have the maple buckets up. Collecting and have started boiling maple syrup. And the first sign of ramps every year is where the leaf litter is kicked out from around the maple trees as I go and collect the sap. You know, that's where you start to see the little tiny emergent ramps, and gives you hope that spring is coming. Next slide, please. But, you know, by, say, up here, by the beginning of April, you'll see this carpet of green. And that's what we live for, is first green thing of spring. Next slide. A little bit later, you start to see the May apples coming up. You can still see the dead leaf litter from the previous year. You can see the emergent ramps, and you can see the May apples starting to open up and grow. So next slide, please. Again, we sell to restaurants and to some distributors ramps, but we also sell some fiddlehead ferns, some stinging nettles, and some wood nettles, all of which grow on the property. Please. And we also try to sell some of the invasives. We find people that are interested in buying Japanese knotweed, believe it or not, and even sometimes garlic mustard, especially in its flowering stages. Chefs love the flowering garlic mustard. Next slide, please. And I really only run this business during ramp season to the extent that we have access to any other products, like any mushrooms, we might sell them. And we might sell them by special order later in the season. But really, ramps are the primary product. Next slide, please. So the customers are restaurants in New York City, Northeast Pennsylvania, distributors, mostly distributors that are dealing with high-end restaurants, and occasionally direct sale. I've never found a good way to transport ramps through mail or through UPS or FedEx. There's always seems to be some problem. So I try not to do that, but sometimes if people want bulbs, dormant bulbs in the fall or seeds, we'll do direct sales by mail. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the season is really mid-April till the end of May. I will be sending out emails to customers probably in about a month, telling them that ramps are coming and fending off those that want them before it's time. And then our first harvest and our first deliveries will be when they get up to marketable size. End of May is optimistic. I have seen the season kind of shift earlier every year. So probably the third week of April to the second week of May is a good bet for this year. And sometimes we will extend it a little bit more if there are other products that people want. Next slide, please. This is kind of the phenology of the business. Ramps are always the first. Burns don't tend to come out until ramps are going for a couple of weeks. Then we get the knotweed shoots, stinging nettles, morels. We're lucky enough to have more morels to sell than we want to eat. Flowering garlic mustard, and then wood nettles. And sometimes we will harvest it in the fall. There's a late season, and some people might request special orders for things in the fall, like knotweed rhizome or even stinging nettle rhizome. Next slide, please. So it's all about digging. I have a group of people that come and help. They're all paid well, and it starts with keys that the diggers get. This is where we're going to dig today. We rotate through the site every day so that we never go to the same site, same portion of the site twice. And people have keys as to which ones to take, what to do if they happen to dig up some baby seedlings or other things, how to replant them. And they'll dig them up, they'll put them into 5-gallon buckets. When the 5-gallon buckets are full, they'll put them into bins that are placed in the woods, and then we'll get them out of the woods. Next slide, please. Those are the bins. There's a whole process. We try to keep the ramps going from the ground into the buckets, into the bins throughout the process in such a way that, the dirty part, the bulb and roots are down so that the dirt doesn't get into the leaves. And handling is very important. Keeping it out of the sun is very important. And ultimately, storing is very important. When I began, I would store ramps in the garage or in the basement or whatever, but by the time the ramps reach the most marketable and mature stage, really, I found that it's really important to use walk-in refrigerators for storage. Otherwise, they tend to turn really fast. Next slide, please. And one of the things I think differentiated my business from other businesses that my customers had been dealing with was not only the handling and the processing and the selection, but washing and packaging. I found that my customers really appreciated what we were providing because they were used to getting big bags of dirty ramps, and when we deliver them, they've all been washed and sorted and weighed and packaged appropriately. We started out on the left in the beginning, like laying them out on the plastic sheet and washing them that way, but we migrated to these racks that are now at waist height. It's better for bending, it's better for cleanliness. The bulbs are down, so they're washed in such a way, they're rinsed, the leaves are rinsed, and then the bulbs are washed in such a way that the dirt comes off the plant and doesn't lodge in the bulb crevices. Next slide, please. And part of it is weighing. I learned early on from one of my wholesalers that he wasn't happy with the weights that I was selling. Said for produce, you always use a hanging scale. And in this business, which is a produce business, the customers really keep an eye on that. They don't want to buy water. They don't want to buy dirt. They want an accurate weight. So everything is weighed using a hanging scale, and the weights are accurate. And then next slide. And then we sell in the minimum orders of 20-pound lots, really. Everything is packed in bins, sometimes bags for smaller portions, but they are packed in the bins with the roots down, the leaves up. There may be a little bit of moisture at the bottom just to keep them fresh. They're stored in walk-in refrigerators, and they're brought to market really quickly. And usually, for most of the customers, as soon as I deliver them, they go into their walk-in refrigerator. Next slide, please. So, typically we'll have a 4 or 5 person crew. They're paid hourly in cash. They are paid to dig, wash, weigh, and bag. And our work week is really 2 to 3 days per week, 8 hours per day. All kinds of people have dug ramps for Delaware Valley ramps, young teenagers and middle-aged guys and old guys like me. And some of the people that dig have come back year after year because they like being in the woods. They get to see all kinds of things in this meditative process that they might not otherwise see. And then there's usually one person who is doing the delivery. Too often it's me, but I have other people that have done deliveries. Next slide, please. So, every business needs to think about marketing. Well, ramps market themselves. People contact me to buy ramps, and my biggest problem every year is that the chefs will hear about ramps that have shown up at the farmer's market or seen it online, and it's 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before I'm ever interested in harvesting because those ramps have come from somewhere else. It's more than a regional market. Ramps are harvested everywhere from far south all the way up into Michigan, and those ramps try to find their way to urban areas. And my customers, my loyal customers, wait until the ramps are ready. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. So, I can go out and harvest 5 pounds an hour when the ramps are mature. I'd like to say I can harvest 5 pounds an hour, but I can only do it 45 minutes a day. I count on my crew to do 3 pounds per hour, and it takes about an hour of washing, weighing, bagging for every 4 hours of digging. And, the biggest cost, besides managing the woods and managing the habitat, is the labor. The labor over the course of the season really averages out to 50% of the cost of goods. And as Eric said, when we push it to the early stages of the marketable harvest, the ramps are small. We sell by the pound, and typically we barely break even the first week. But it makes it up in the end when the ramps mature and swell out, and takes fewer ramps to make up a pound. Next slide, please. So last year we did 400 pounds and about 50 pounds of other products. The best year was 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Everybody wanted something green from outside, and people were reluctant to go out and got orders from everywhere. And, in a typical year, we'll do 350, 400 pounds, but we've done as much as 800 pounds in the season. And like all food businesses, there's always some turnover. Customers, it's a relationship business. You develop relationships with chefs and buyers, and they turn over. So you always have to be looking out for new customers while you make your existing customers happy. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to reinforce that ramps will grow anywhere. They will grow in full sun in gardens, but they won't reproduce through seed propagation. And really what you're looking for is good habitat that allows flowering all over the place and development of a lot of seeds. This is an interesting picture here that I selected. You can see in this active flowering area, there's invasives. There happens to be some garlic mustard, some stoke grass. This is the middle of the summer when everything has come up, and even a stalk of Japanese knotweed that probably came in on a rhizome fragment in the flood of 2006, which covered the entire ramp field. I go around and I try to manage the invasive to the extent that I can by cutting the knotweed or digging it out, etc. But ramps are very, very suited to this type of habitat. They're very durable, and if in the right habitat, they will grow well. Next slide, please. So I've decided to pivot this business for this year. I'm getting old. It's harder and harder to find people. And so this year, we're going to try something different. We're going to try a ramp you-pick model. We're going to address the ramp business as an experiential business where people who are interested in seeing and learning about ramps and harvesting some for their own use will be invited to buy a ticket, come at a designated time. We will provide training, tools, and rotate patches throughout the season so that no area is over harvested, even down to a very small area, and we'll see how it goes. And some of my old customers might still want some ramps, and we might address that, but by and large, we're changing it up to a experiential model. Ramps you pick, like apples or blueberries or anything else. Next slide. So, next one, the last one. There you go. So that's that's my contact information. That's a sign of a good ramp season. My hand all beat up, and thank you, and I'll be around for any questions.
Excellent. Okay, so we have at least 15 minutes for some Q&A. And I'm going to kind of moderate this. I'm going to invite Steve to chime in, or otherwise just interrupt me if you've got something you want to add. So I've been looking through the Q&A a little bit and seeing what kind of questions are out there. Let me just see if I can kind of chip away at some of these things. So the first one that I can answer really quickly, and again, if people have different experiences here, certainly we invite you to kind of share your experience in the Q&A. Aaron asked a little while ago about deer being an issue for ramp cultivation. It's an interesting question, and actually we do have some research going on here in Pennsylvania where we have a researcher at Penn State Beaver, which is over near Pittsburgh, that has been to Steve's area, in fact, Autumn Sabo. And so she's been working with us and piggybacking on a lot of our research sites to look at the impact of deer on some of these sites. And what we're finding is that deer will typically eat everything but the ramps. They just don't like that onion flavor, it would seem, in most areas unless they're forced to eat it. And that includes areas outside of Philadelphia where we have research sites and the deer populations are extremely unbalanced and they don't have a whole lot to eat. They tend to avoid ramps. So something about the allicin or the phytochemistry of ramps makes them not necessarily too attractive for deer. AJ asks, can you expand a little on the diseases and pests that ramps are susceptible to? It's a great question. For the most part, we don't really have to deal with anything that wipes out ramps as a disease or a pest, but there are a couple of things that you'll notice in the landscape that you'll often wonder maybe what's going on there. We've seen some small kinds of insects, mites in particular, that occur late in the season on plants. We've also seen a septoria, which is a kind of leaf fungus spot. So you'll see a lot of spots that develop on the leaves as they're starting to turn yellow. We've had some of our plant pathologists here at Penn State identify that as this Allium septoria bacterial leaf splotch. And that doesn't seem to kill the plants, but it certainly affects the aesthetics and perhaps the saleability, especially of the foliage late in the season. One pest that I do want to note that we've been tracking here in Pennsylvania, and it's in adjacent states, has been the Allium leaf miner, ALM. And Allium leaf miner is an exotic pest that was introduced probably on ornamental alliums from Europe. It was first found actually in Lancaster County, southeastern Pennsylvania, and has been spreading from there to different areas. So now it occurs up in some of the onion growing areas in the Hudson Valley. And Steve, I don't think you've seen it. We haven't seen it on your patch, but we do see it occasionally on areas in the eastern portion of Pennsylvania. And essentially what it does at this time, all we can say is you can see some feeding marks on the foliage. It's a fly, and so the maggot has the potential to pupate and or to feed on the layers of the bulb. It creates a lot of loss in leeks, garden leeks and onions in parts of Pennsylvania, but we haven't necessarily seen it move on to the bulbs of Allium tricoccum ramps. And so while it's out there and we're keeping an eye on it, it doesn't seem to be a threat, at least at this time, to ramps. Cynthia's asking, do ramps grow under walnut? Yes, it's one of the species that we often find them. Walnuts often grow in these mesic areas that are rich, often moist, valley bottom, floodplain areas. And so, yeah, we see them showing up with walnuts. And if you're also asking whether the juglone is something that might affect, for those who don't know that walnuts have a allelopathic, a chemical warfare, if you will, effect on nearby vegetation. But as it turns out, it's not all vegetation. Walnuts don't necessarily kill many plants. And As far as we know, many members of the Allium genus aren't affected. And so, yeah, they grow just fine underneath walnuts. Steve asks if gypsum would help as a supplement. Absolutely. It's been implicated as one of the sources of calcium supplementation that might be useful, particularly on a small scale. What we often discuss really is at what scale can you feasibly add amendments to a patch, right? So if it's a small little patch out back of your house, well, that's not too much of a problem to take a sack of gypsum up and spread it around every now and then. But if we're talking about rather large areas that you're going to have to move through with equipment, you're going to, take some risks, not only in terms of the logistics of getting in there with all that weight, but also of just damaging bulbs. Remember, these bulbs are not too far beneath the soil surface and leaf duff. And so we want to be careful about driving equipment over top of it and that sort of thing, even if it's just a four-wheeler. Chris asks about how did ramps do with pine trees, Southwestern Virginia. Depends on the pine species. We do see in Pennsylvania, white pine, eastern white pine is a small component of, as I mentioned, sugar maple, tulip poplar stands. That doesn't seem to be too bad as an indicator species. It's not what I would consider something that we look for, but it doesn't rule it out as well. So you don't want to get attached to any particular one tree species. You want to kind of think about the larger site traits that I mentioned. Is it a northeast facing slope? Is it cool and moist throughout the growing season? Those sorts of things. Is there any problem with frost heave of the fall transplanted bulbs? Great question. As many of you may know, I grow garlic, and maybe some of you do too, and that can be a problem with fall planted garlic, right? If you put it in an agronomic soil, you get some freezing in that soil, and if you're not deep enough, it can get popped out, or if you don't mulch with some sort of straw, it can get popped out. The difference here is that in most forested sites, because of that insulating organic matter layer, we don't get quite the freezing that you would see in open field conditions. And so what that means is it's not as harsh on the bulbs. And I suppose that in some situations you might get a little bit of heaving, but if you can get them in the ground, I think early enough in the fall, and there's plenty of leaf cover over top of them, they should be just fine. Okay, I'm reading down through. So I think someone just said, I don't see the questions. It's a Q&A bar at the bottom. I don't know if you can all see the questions, but I can. Could you share some of the research articles that discuss the different compound levels at the different stages of harvest? Great question, Megan. We have a research paper that's in preparation right now that shares the results of what I was just sharing a brief snippet from. But I would say anybody who's interested in a deep dive into that, I have a thesis that I can send you a link to, and you can download the electronic document. It's 100 pages plus, so it's a lot of information to digest, but some of you might be interested in it. But we're trying to build that into a research paper and get it submitted here this spring. Rob asks, what about harvesting for flavor? Excellent question. We actually, again, I don't mean to kind of, Janine and others are doing work around ramps and have done work around ramps, so feel free to chime in here. But this area of what's in ramps and how does the flavor vary according to the stage, the colors of it, this is really an active area of research that a number of folks are engaged in. We're engaged in as well. We actually just got a specialty crop grant to do a sensory panel. Particularly with different stages of harvest, but also the different colors. Some people maintain that the green shafted ramps have a milder flavor than the purple. Other people say that the purple have a milder flavor than the green. Some people say that as the bulbs swell up, as I was implicating for harvesting for weight, that they actually become hot, so to speak, and they don't necessarily like that flavor, and maybe only pickle those. So there is definitely a transition, it would seem, in the sulfur compounds over the course of the growing season, with a milder flavor earlier in the season and a hotter or spicier flavor later in the season. What I would suggest is we don't know enough about that to kind of tie it to any kind of date or stage or color, that sort of thing. But it is certainly true that a lot of people pick up on different subtle flavor differences over the course of the season. I personally notice that the bulbs get a little bit more pungent when they're at full size. And those bulbs I often use for pickling. P says, what are good companion species to encourage in my ramp beds? Any species to specifically weed out besides invasives? So there's a whole list of species I didn't really get into because that's a whole nother topic or rabbit hole to kind of go through and introduce and how you identify. But essentially what you're thinking about from a habitat standpoint, at least from the mid-Atlantic region, as I mentioned, we have blue cohosh and sugar maple as being two real key indicators that we found across the state for good sites with high calcium and moisture. Other species would include in the overstory basswoods, ash where they still exist, tulip poplars. Okay. In the understory, Steve hit on a couple of them. We look for things like yellow trout lily early in the season, and later in the season we look for wood nettles. So those are different than stinging nettles. Stinging nettles are urtica, wood nettles are laportia. So we look for wood nettles later in the season. They seem to be good indicators for those nice, rich, moist sites later in the season. Let's see, what animals eat ramps? I think I already addressed that, but we don't really see a whole lot of things that prefer to eat ramps, at least in my experience. And I would suggest from talking with others that it's just not a target plant. It's usually the other plants, the trout lilies and the Solomon seals and the other things that are growing with the ramps that become the target for the deer. Robin says, is there any documented association between the number of leaves and the likelihood of flowering? And the answer is yes. There's a direct relationship between the biomass above ground and below ground. So what happens is ramps go through different stages of development. If you look at the biology webinar that you have a link for, we kind of break it down and all the different stages in there. But essentially after the ramps germinate and from seed and start to grow, they develop one leaf. And they proceed through a variety of stages until they can become as many as 4-leaved plants, although those are uncommon. But you can see 2 and 3 leaves quite commonly. At those stages of 2 and 3 leaf plants, that's when we start to see flowering and fruiting. And usually when we get to 3 and 4 leaf plants, we see more flowers and more seed production. So there's a definite direct linear relationship between, how much biomass the plant has and its ability to produce more flowers, more seeds. Jim asks a related question about at what age that occurs. Typically, again, that's a product of site quality and productivity. It can occur in as little as 2 or 3 years, but oftentimes, even on good sites, might take as many as 4, 5, or 6 years before we start to get serious seed production. Leah asks, what's the best practice for planting the seeds? Pulling the leaves back, spreading them, not too deeply, but beneath the leaf surface, right? So usually what I aim for is just maybe a 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep in the mineral soil after pulling back the organic matter. But, those little grass-like threads of those little seedlings that are germinated, they'll get overwhelmed fairly quickly if there's too much leaf mass on top of them. So, Steve mentioned this earlier, and I'll just kind of reiterate, ramps, mature ramp bulbs can grow in full sunlight, as we talked about, in a variety of conditions. What seems to be critical here is that the right habitat is required for seeds to germinate and to grow into plants. And that habitat then is a moist, shaded habitat that doesn't dry out the seeds. So you want to make sure they get into the mineral soil below the leaves, but not underneath too much leaf cover, because they just won't make it up through. Ruth says on that note, what is it about oak that ramps don't do well in? First thing I would say is that we have found that some oak trees are associated with ramps in Pennsylvania, for example, white and red oak, which tend to occur on moister and better sites. But going back to what I just said, oak leaves are very slow to decompose and they pile up. So when you get these oak dominated stands, they often form this kind of recalcitrant thatch that just kind of lays there, especially near logs and in small brush and that sort of stuff. And if you pull that away, you often see that little seeds are just struggling to get up through there. They look like little bean sprouts trying to get up through there. So I think it has a lot to do with which type of oak and whether it's the right habitat, but it also has to do with the type of leaf cover that oaks will put down. Holly's asking about price per pound for ramps. I could give you a range, but I think that might be directed at you, Steve. Do you care to share what it is that you seek for price per pound?
Yeah, it depends on the market, depends on the time of year. You know, New York City is my prime market. You can see them going for as much as, I don't know, $6 a bunch, which typically a bunch is a quarter pound, so that would be like $24 a pound. I don't sell retail, so I'm in the wholesale market. I've seen it anywhere from $12 to $20, $22 a pound.
Yeah, likewise. I would say from my perspective that ramps are being undervalued in the marketplace in many instances. I see them going for way too little. And so, you know, it gets to this issue of, you know, making sure that you're asking for fair compensation for a plant that takes years to develop, almost like a nursery operation. So don't undercut yourself. And as Steve pointed out, that often means that you might have to turn down some markets and seek out other markets that are a little more lucrative, but you don't necessarily want to give them away. You know, it takes time for these things to grow to maturity, and it takes time and effort for you to manage with intention these patches so that it's sustainable. Jamie's asking what the timing or season would be for Southeast Virginia. Anybody from Southeast Virginia got an answer to that that's got vocal abilities?
They'll probably need to put it in the chat just because the audio is disabled for participants.
Well, I guess I'm asking for Janine or anybody else that might want to chime in.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay. Earlier than Pennsylvania.
Question. We'd love to wrap up, Eric, and then maybe if you're up for staying on for a little bit extra, we'll try to get through as many more questions as we can.
Absolutely. Yeah. You wind it down.
Okay, great. Well, Eric, Stephen, thank you all so much for spending the evening with us and sharing your expertise around ramps. This will be a great resource that'll be archived on our website that will be available for people in perpetuity. So thanks so much for contributing to that. Also, thank you all for attending this evening. We want to make you aware of upcoming programs. March 10th, we have forest farming of fungi. March 24th, forest farming of ginseng. April 14th, golden seal and other NTFPs. And let's see. We also want to invite you to connect with the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. You're welcome to become a member. It's free of cost, and it just is a way for you to stay in the loop with all of our offerings. You can also follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and also, let's see, on our website. We also have a great YouTube page as well. And we invite you as well to share your feedback about this event this evening. Margaret's putting a link in the chat. It's real quick. We'd love to just hear from you. And also have seen in the chat already a lot of people just really sending their thanks, Eric and Stephen, for such informative talks, finding that it was really useful. So we encourage folks to add more comments in the chat if you have feedback for Eric and Stephen and for the work that we're pulling together and sharing in this webinar series. Would love to hear from you. Also would love to thank our partners, Penn State, NC State, the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Coalition, Catawba Sustainability Center as well. And thank the folks behind the scenes who are making this happen, Margaret, Janine, John, and Sarah and Stasha as well. So the team has been pulling this all together for you all, and we're really grateful to be getting the information out. So thank you all so much for joining today. And that's all I have to share. Eric and Stephen, if y'all would like to answer the remaining questions that we can, maybe for 10, 15 more minutes, see how many more questions we can move through. I'd love to pass it back to you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. I see a lot of you checking out and leaving some good feedback. We appreciate that. I do want to, before I return to some questions, there are some feedback that I asked for. Rob was saying that he has had success with replanting of the basil plates, right, with harvested tops. So that's what we hear, and this is good information. I know that this is something that a lot of people are talking about in the research world in terms of how reliable is this and under what conditions. So I think you're going to see some dedicated research going into that if it's not already underway here very soon. It does seem to be a viable strategy, at least in some scenarios. So thanks for sharing that. Let's see. Okay, I'm just going to jump in here with it, just picking out, cherry picking. If people have a specific question that you'd like to send me via email afterwards, or Steve, feel free to do that if you didn't get answered. But I'm just going to pick out a few things that I think are some pretty good and different questions than from what we've had answered already. Anderson asks about washing the ramps prior to selling, or do the buyers like them untouched? I think Steve addressed that from his market standpoint. I'll just address it from my knowledge of dealing with folks here in Pennsylvania, is that clean is what they want. As clean as possible, which sometimes can be easier said than done, but that includes the leaves as well as the bulbs and the roots. Sending them to market, particularly to chefs or people who are going to pay maybe a little bit more for them. Not only do they have to clean them and they get a little bit frustrated by them coming in with dirt all over them, but as Steve said, it does add to the weight if they've got clumps of dirt all over them. And so that's just something that a lot of buyers don't necessarily want to see, especially if you're developing a relationship at a good price point.
I'd like to add that you often see ramps in the market with, as they would say in the business, trimmed, meaning the roots have been cut off. And I don't have customers that ask for it, but if I did, I would say no, because as far as I'm concerned, we're delivering a live plant that might be used immediately. It could be stored for a week or more in cold storage, but it might be used immediately or might be used a week later. But I want to have the roots on it so it can continue to survive and be happy. And the only time we will process ramps that are trimmed is late in the season if we get orders for what I call just bulbs, meaning a chef just wants bulbs to grill or to pickle or whatever. We will trim the leaves off, we will trim the roots off. They'll get, a bag of perfectly ready to use ramp bulbs. But that's the only time we'll ever do that.
Okay, excellent. So I think a lot of this is stuff I've already answered, so I'm just kind of cherry picking through here to see if anything's been missed. There's some questions about, growing from seed, really more technical questions, and I'm going to kind of just say a general response to them. So there's some questions about, can you propagate from seed, and what's the seeding rate, per acre, rate per pound, that sort of stuff. What I would say, and I'd invite Janine if she's got any horticultural insights she wants to share here. But in my experience, seed propagation, again, is absolutely possible. Handling the seed has to be approached with some caution because it's a difficult seed to germinate in some cases, especially using traditional methods like putting them in flats, trying to keep them moist, exposing them to the warmer and colder temperatures that they often require to stimulate the seed coat break and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit beyond what some people want to do or maybe have the patience for, or, really can manage over 12, 18 months or so. And so oftentimes it's just suggested in a lot of these forest farming crops is just plant the seeds back in the zone or start a new patch somewhere else nearby with those seeds, rather than taking them from the woods and trying to play around with them and keep track of them and, you know, deal with their finicky kind of behavior, if you will. In terms of a seeding rate, you know, that's going to be up to each individual forest farmer in terms of like how much you want to put out, how much area you have for planting, how much seed you have to work with, frankly. But whenever I seed at some of our locations, for example, at Shavers Creek Environmental Center, we have some of our research plots. I'm usually putting maybe 2 or 3 seeds per square foot, expecting that maybe I get 1 or 2 of them to germinate. And, you know, that's just a ballpark kind of measure what I do. I don't get too wound up about exactly how much I'm putting down, just try and spread it out a little bit. Steve, you have anything you want to share on that?
I rarely try to establish new plots by seed. Mostly I will establish it by transplanting bulbs. And I have taken the remains when I'm like pickling ramps. I've taken the basil plate and roots and, you know, planted them, and they do establish, but I can't tell you scientifically what the success is. Mostly I just broadcast seeds in areas where I think it would be helpful, and you know, in good patches of flowering ramps, I don't know, a seed head might have 24 seeds total, and there might be, you know, 6 flowering plants per square meter. So I think that's what nature would look for. Maybe a little bit denser than what you're doing, but not that much denser.
Okay, thank you. I'm down at the end of the Q&A because we see a lot of people have dropped off, but we still have over 100 of you out there. And so I'm looking at the more recent questions, assuming that you're still online and that you're waiting for an answer. So I'll just kind of pick away at some of those real quick here. Warren is asking about the storage once you harvest it. And you did touch on that a little bit, but I would add a little bit and maybe ask you to, if you have anything more you want to say about it, that the leaf-only harvest I've heard from a lot of folks is the trickiest one to deal with, right? And so if you're harvesting only leaves for yourself, maybe it doesn't matter a whole lot that those leaves look pretty wilty by the time you get them back to home or once you put them in the fridge. But people who are trying to sell leaf-only harvest seem to be dealing with a quick and rapid kind of wilting that maybe doesn't come back, right? You don't get those leaves to perk back up and look nice and fleshy and green, which is what you want them to look like when they're sitting on the store shelf, if you will. And so that seems to be one of the sticking points from a commercial standpoint with leaf-only harvest in many markets is that a lot of the outlets like the grocery stores, the co-ops and that sort of stuff are having a hard time keeping those leaves from looking like a bunch of green goo after a couple of days of sitting there on the shelf, even with misters. So you have any insight or thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, it also very much depends on the phenological stage of the plants when they are getting ready to senesce and before the flowers come up, when you start to see some of that fungus or yellowing or whatever, the leaves will turn rapidly, even in cold storage. They will turn once they're out of the ground in like a day or two. So early in the season, when the plants are young and vigorous, they'll store and stay fresh a lot longer. At the end of the season, they'll go really fast. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Couple other questions here. So Lisa, hi Lisa. Lisa's a student of mine. She's asking one of these deep rabbit hole questions that maybe she tried to bait me into this one here. Are the red stemmed and the green stemmed plants different species? Are they different varieties, and does their flavor vary? The easy thing I'll say, I kind of already addressed this, is that it still remains to be determined from a scientific standpoint to what extent the flavor varies between these different color morphs and, what that's caused by. But there's a lot of anecdotal information out there, myself included, that does suggest that there may be some difference in the flavor profiles, especially over the course of those stages that we talked about. The other thing I'll mention that Lisa's bringing up is, as you noticed in some of the pictures, I don't get into that today, but I get into it in one of the webinars, that this is a long-standing conversation point in ramp culture about what is going on with the different color morphs in ramps. Part of the phytochemistry work that we've been doing has been trying to look at whether some of that might be explained by some of the phenolics, the anthocyanins, which are these purple pigments that are found typically in allium species like red onions and red, what do they call them, winter onions like chives and things like that, scallions, things like that. And what we found is that there's no difference really in the phenolic compounds between those two. So we continue to look for what might explain that chemically, but you see that throughout alliums in general. You can look at it just in cultivated onions, right? Some are red onions, some are white, some are yellows. You can see it, as I just mentioned, in scallions. You can see it in what we call onion grass, Allium vineale, which is a wild species that's been introduced that you see this time of the year popping up in forests and disturbed areas. You can see some of them have a red shaft to them and some of them have a green. So that seems to be something that's present throughout alliums. And it's not clearly understood, at least to my knowledge, what's going on there, but it is a part of the investigation that's going on right now about what causes those color morphs, and is there anything associated with that from a genetic standpoint or phytochemistry standpoint. Now, to Lisa's question, do we consider those different varieties? No, but we have figured out that there are as many as 4 different lineages of ramps that occur across Appalachia. And some of you might be like, what? Yeah, so basically we've got more than one species. Some of you may have heard of a species called Allium burdickii, sometimes called Allium tricoccum variety burdickii or subspecies burdickii. We've just established that that species exists in Western Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh, on a handful of sites. It's the only place it's known from this far north in Pennsylvania. And that is definitely a different species. We're tracking it. We have it planted in common gardens. We're studying the phytochemistry of it and the genetics of it. And we're working with a gentleman by the name of Harvey Ballard, who's in Ohio, who's been doing a variety of what we call common garden studies, where you take these different ramps and you plant them side by side and you look at how they develop. What are the different kind of timing of when they emerge? When do they produce flowers? How tall are they? How big are they? How many flowers they produce in an umbel? All those sorts of questions. So ramps and how many species and lineages there are out there is an unsettled question. It's been posited since the 1940s that there's more than one ramp out there. And it seems to be bearing true the more and more we look at the question that actually there's more than one ramp out there. And the color morphs may play into that. So burdickii, for example, only has green stems. It does not occur in a purple stem form. Okay. So lots of really interesting and cool, I think, science going on out there around ramps right now to kind of answer some of these basic questions that maybe some of us thought were already answered. Other questions here I see. Bree is asking whether the information I shared would work for Connecticut. And I would say, yes, we're not too far away from one another. And I would argue that many of the same indicator species and certainly soil moisture appears to be a common thread throughout the range of ramps in terms of being important. Okay, there may be a little bit of tweaks in your particular locality, but generally speaking, this seems to be a trend that soil moisture coupled with calcium is an important feature of where ramps not grow, but where they thrive, right? And so that's the point we're making, is good productive sites that you want the ramps to spread and spread rapidly. We want to identify what are the features of those sites, and moisture and calcium seem to be 2 features. Quincy's saying, I noticed thin matted huckleberry roots in my ramp patch, which is of course a huckleberry patch. I wonder if the roots may be impeding the spread of my ramps. Any thoughts and experience with that? All I can say, Quincy, is that is the first time that I've heard that huckleberry is growing with ramps. In my mind here in the mid-Atlantic, they're in two different environments. I often think of huckleberries in the Ericaceae as being very similar to blueberries and requiring more of an acidic site, and ramps often growing in sites that are more basic and have abundant calcium. And so I can't really answer that, but I can answer the competition standpoint that you're asking about as to whether the roots may be impeding spread of ramps. And I would say anytime you have below ground competition or impediments to the spreading of roots and the cloning of the bulbs, of course, there's going to be some impact, right? And so that's where we get into this issue of, if my ground is just full of roots and boulders and that sort of stuff, maybe I should make a bed, something to create a little bit more of a TLC scenario, right? Tender loving care scenario where the ramps will actually spread a little bit and thrive. Okay. Let's see. Have you seen, Holly saying, have I seen them grow under mountain laurel and rhododendron? Never. I consider those to be anti-plants, at least in Pennsylvania. Now, do plants do things that I'm always surprised about? All the time. Okay. But in terms of would I advise people to plant underneath rhododendrons and mountain laurels and things like that? I would not, at least in mid-Atlantic region. Maybe others have a different experience elsewhere in the range. Chris is asking, do you know of any machinery that helps clean ramps post-harvest? I would defer to Steve here and say that you saw a picture with him with a really cool little apparatus. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
So every year during the washing time, which takes a lot of time, fantasized about building machinery of various types. The standard vegetable drum that a lot of produce farmers use might work, except for the sediments that the ramps grow in, at least on my property, are very fine and would end up, I think, getting into the plant itself. I've come up with ideas about bee funnels that you could transport the ramps by water down with the roots down and all that. The best thing I've found so far is these racks with wire screens where everything falls out except for the ramps, and it takes a little bit more time, but it works.
Excellent. Megan, I got your email. I'll send you an email with the link to the thesis here when we're done. And I think we're going to start to wind it down. A lot of the questions here, I think we've gotten to the big ones. If anybody's with us that is back in this thread that you're like, oh, just please answer this last question, feel free to type it in now. Otherwise, we're going on 8 o'clock and I'm losing my voice a little bit, so we might just wind it down a little bit.
Sounds like a good idea, Eric. Yeah, thank you both so much for staying on a little bit extra to be able to answer the questions. And again, we'll make sure this recording is available for folks who've registered and will be on our website as well.
Okay. I have one last question I'll answer from Brian. He just got it in there under the fold, and I saw it back there a little bit. Came in late, so sorry if this question was already answered. What do you all think about harvesting ramp bulbs in the fall? I heard a forager saying that they are better to harvest them because the bulbs are larger and then the seeds are able to disperse into the ground. And I would say, yeah, so you did come late. If you look at earlier section of the recording, which will be available to you before too long, you'll see I talked a little bit about how the bulb size changes over the course of the growing season. And by the time we get to that flowering and fruiting stage in summer, we start to get a maximally sized bulb. And so transplanting bulbs or harvesting bulbs, if that's your target, is anytime after the seeds have formed into the fall. Just think about traditional practices with propagating plants, perennial plants that come from bulbs and roots. Is oftentimes we move them around or dig them in the fall, including medicinal plants that we're going to consume. So absolutely waiting until the seeds mature, making sure those seeds get in the ground, and then harvesting some bulbs. is a fine idea. I would just say that make sure you keep an eye on the patch from the beginning of the growing season through the end, so that you have a good sense of how much is there. In other words, it's much more difficult to gauge how much of thinning you're doing in a patch when you can't really see all of the plants, because only a certain proportion of them are going to have flowers and fruit on the top. So it's often a good practice just to kind of get to know your patch over the course of the seasons, figure out how much is there before you start deciding that you're going to harvest in the fall when you're heading into dormant season and things are a little less easy to kind of visually look at and assess. Ellen asked about how to get a small crop started. Get yourself some bulbs, get yourself some seeds, scatter them in a good moist and shaded area. As I started out by saying, I've got a few that I put in my garden years ago that basically is my native plant garden that's in full sun, and they don't ever really flower and set seed. Well, I should say they flower, but they don't really set seed in that position, but they are cloning themselves. So as we have emphasized, ramps are pretty hardy. That clonal ability of them to divide and spread, as long as you've got adequate moisture, they'll hang in there, and you can grow them just underneath the deck or that sort of stuff. But whether they can germinate from seed in those kinds of locations seems to be the issue and the hang up if you're looking to have them spread that way. Okay, last one. Paul's saying, I asked about ironwood. We have a large stand. Will ramps grow with ironwood? So ironwood, to me, refers to two possible species, both of which are related. We have ironwood, which is Carpinus caroliniana, musclewood, in other words. And then we have ironwood, which is Australia virginiana. That's also known as hop hornbeam. And we have found in Pennsylvania that ramps grow with both species, but they tend to show up more with Carpinus, because Carpinus, or musclewood, is a species that we find more on kind of moister, wetter forested sites. In fact, at least in much of Pennsylvania, it grows right up along stream edges. So I would suggest that moisture factor wins out here, and we see it a little bit more commonly with Carpinus caroliniana ironwood than we do Australia virginiana ironwood.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. I'm excited to get this recording. We'll make sure to get it professionally captioned and up on our website in the next week. We'll make sure to share it too as well, Stephen and Eric, so you have it for your records.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. There's still 75 of you plus out there. So thanks for hanging in. It must have been at least somewhat worth hanging out. And thanks, Steve, for sharing all of your business secrets and wisdom and experience, and joining us tonight. And I'm going to be following along to see how that U-pick operation works out.
Thanks, Eric. And if anyone wants information about that, we'll be posting information about it on the Facebook page that Katie shared, or Margaret shared, and on the website itself.
Awesome. Good night, everybody.
Hey,
Thank
good
you.
night, everyone.